Just before Season of Discovery dropped, I made a big video going over class predictions for Phase 1. As of right now, we are well over a month into the season, with Phase 2 expected to drop towards late January or possibly early Feb. So I thought, why not do a bit of a recap, a snapshot of the state of Season of Discovery at level 25 as it currently is, and to take a look at which classes have really come out on top given everything that we now know about the season. Because so far for me there has definitely been a few surprises which I did not expect, but we will talk about each class, what I expected, what has happened, and of course why things are currently the way they are. Keep in mind there will of course be new runes released with Phase 2, and at the moment we don't know how many runes or new rune engraving slots there will be. It may well be the case that the best classes in Phase 1 keep getting better, or we could see a big meta shift. So I wouldn't read too hard into this as to which class will be the best for the whole season, we simply don't know that. Also, Blizzard is doing active class balancing this season as well. It could be the case your spec gets a nerf or a big buff and changes quite dramatically before the end of Phase 1. This is kinda how WoW looks when we don't know everything in advance for once. But let's take a look back at which classes are topping DPS meters, dominating PvP and calling the shots, and which ones leave a bit to be desired still. It's time to take a look back and see how right or wrong I was about classes in Phase 1 of Season of Discovery. But first, a quick word from today's sponsor, Boot.dev. Boot.dev is an online platform that equips self-motivated individuals with the tools they need to forge a career in back-end development. Boot.dev's learning process is a little bit different though, and with the aim of keeping things fresh and interesting, they treat it like a real-life RPG, where as you progress you earn things such as experience, achievements, and you can even go on to compete for places on a leaderboard versus others. On this platform you'll be getting to grips with both Python and Go programming languages, and most importantly, Boot.dev will be encouraging you to write and understand your own code and not just be doing things in theory or from a book. Doing for me has always been key to learning and fully understanding something, and you just can't beat first-hand experience and the process of trial and error when it comes to really getting information to stick. There's even a community Discord to compare progress and ask for help when you start advancing onto some of the more complicated problems. And you can start all this today at your own pace. So click the link in the description box below and use my code WillE to get 25% off your first payment for Boot.dev. That's 25% your first month or your first year, depending on the subscription that you choose. Many thanks to Boot.dev for the sponsor today. Let's get back to WoW. As is tradition with these videos, I like starting with the cloth wearers and rotating through the different armor types. So today we'll begin with the priest. I expected the priest's healer identity to remain just overall good, whilst expecting Shadow to struggle in this early phase of the season, and I'd say that's been largely true. The bit that could use some emphasis though is just really how good priest healers have been in PvP. I don't know if you've tried much Warsong Gulch yet, but PvP doesn't mean player versus player in Season of Discovery. What it really means is priest versus priest, and the side with more priests tends to win. As a healer, they are incredibly mana efficient, have the only defensive magical dispel, and thanks to a few undocumented changes from Blizzard's end on damage dealt in battlegrounds, they are just kind of impossible to solo for any class. A Warsong without priests versus 2 or more on the enemy team is playing such an uphill battle when you want to win. On the PvE side of things, we all thought priests would be great at healing, and hey, what do you know? Turns out they're still pretty good. They have such a well-rounded toolkit of heals that the few extra abilities they got from runes only push them further and make them that much better. One thing that's become noticeable for this class in this season, however, is how powerful the homunculi rune really is. Pre-launch, I was speculating this rune would basically serve as a generic rune to provide tank debuffs, because none of the new tanking specs can apply your typical attack speed slows, sunder, demo shout, and so on. It turns out that's exactly what homunculi does, but it does it far more efficiently than any tank does it as well. In fact, Homunculi's Sunder Armor effect reduces a boss's armor by over 1000 and is applied instantly if or when they actually decide to hit the correct target. And this is better than what a warrior can do if they spend 5 globals on sundering. This will be because the Homunculi debuff is scaled to level 25, which means this rune is going to be BIS forever for priests in PvE. Whatever your specialization. And yes, people are taking this rune over Prayer of Mending as a healer, because the debuff is just so overpowered. For Shadow, I expected it to be behind other DPS, and it is by a lot. Many of their runes even got buffed early on into the season too, but it really hasn't made too much of a difference in PvE. In the past, I put this down to them missing a bunch of talents, which could add up to 40% damage or more for them, but right now, I'm not convinced that this will be enough to escape the bottom of the meters. The age-old issue for Shadow Priest in vanilla is that they scale with one stat, more or less, spell power, and not very well at that, and this old issue is coming round to haunt them once again. The DPS priest identity needs some help through runes in phase 2 in my opinion. On the PvP side of things, there is kind of a shadow priest build I suppose, but it's more of a hybrid at the moment, and it's really hard to play priest in PvP and not want to be a healer with how good they are at that. Though as per usual, priests are very good in 1v1s and add good group utility to battleground PvP settings. Onto the mage, what I like to call the hero class of vanilla. How are they getting on? Starting with Arcane, I expected the healer identity to be incredibly overpowered thanks to no reduction on heals from AoE effects, and Blizzard did massively nerf the healing from Arcane Explosion not too long after launch, so that was in part solved. But the Living Flame ability is allowing mages to do some truly mage-like things. People are already AoE farming hundreds of elites in dungeons and boosting as well. You really just can't keep this class from doing degenerate things, can you? In the raid for heals, again, as expected, they aren't doing quite as well on single target compared to other healers, but they can clear the raid just fine. Or at least they can now, since the world buff gives 3% spell hit, and some of the bosses don't have crazy arcane spell resist anymore. For damage, Arcane is good enough as well. It seems like a go-to spec when you've just dinged in a bit less gear, and it's even received a buff not long ago, where your Living Flame can now benefit from your Arcane Blast stacks. Fire, though, has been the breakout success in Phase 1 for mages. This one definitely came as a surprise. Typically, fire mages need a whole bunch of crit to really start coming online, but thanks to a ton of bonus spell power on gear, the burnout rune, and being able to get ignite early, they're doing better than expected, especially in the raid. Whilst fire will always have higher variance due to needing to crit, with some good RNG it can be well up there on DPS meters. The letdown for the phase, however, has been Frost. It's straight up the worst PvE spec in the game by a big old margin, and it suffers, as several other specs do, with a bit of an unforeseen flaw of Season of Discovery: spell ranks. So the best rank of Frostbolt you can get at the moment is learned at level 20, and it just doesn't do that much damage. Your next rank would have been at 26, and it does about 80% more damage baseline. And for runes you have Isolance, but you can only get 1 point into the Shatter talent, so essentially Frost just isn't a thing at the moment. It's still got good enough utility in PvP, but the damage from this spec just isn't there. I expect Frost to see big improvements next phase for PvP, but if Fire is already better at 25, I think you're going to be playing Fire for a very long time. Overall, mages are in a good place in PvE, but due to a lack of defensives and Frost damage just not being very good, they currently are not the strongest in PvP. Next is Warlock, my main class, and one which I was definitely hyping up pre-launch, and I'm happy to say it has not disappointed. Warlock has turned out so far to be a very powerful pick in all areas of content for this phase. Perhaps its weakest identity though is for tanking, and that's mainly just to a lack of AoE threat options, but it's not the only tank to have this problem. In PvP though, the Metamorphosis spec kind of hard counters everything that does physical damage. You actually just straight up can't fight them. It's like trying to break through a brick wall with a spoon, but the wall also heals for more damage than you can deal. On the PvE side of things, Locks are the top caster at the moment thanks to a destruction build running Incinerating Chaos Bolt, and they stand to get a whole lot of extra bonus fire damage from talents once we hit phase 2 as well. And I'm just saying, Hellfire, despite not being able to crit in vanilla, is going to be dealing some nasty damage, both to enemies and the Warlock themselves. Unfortunately, every spec involving Shadowbolt is bad because we have the same problem Frost mages do and then our last rank we learned was at level 20. I really want Shadowbolt Volley to work. Maybe next phase we can give it another go. As for the Affliction-centric builds, they are amazing for leveling, as expected. This class has practically no downtime at all once you have Master Channeler and Haunt, because they just heal for so much you can always life tap your mana back. I've been really happy with the Warlock so far in Season of Discovery, and I hope it remains strong into Phase 2, and that other casters can move up a little bit more to where their power level is at. Onto the Leather Enjoyers, Druid first. I just got done leveling my Druid and was balanced the whole way, and would you believe it that balance is now probably one of the strongest levelers in the game. Now that is a big change from vanilla, where the spec was kind of just meme-worthy. Balance can now cast Wrath for free thanks to a rune, picks up Sunfire early, which is just a better version of Moonfire, and most importantly has Star Surge. Star Surge received a 182% damage buff quite early into the season, as well as having its mana cost reduced to practically nothing. Seriously, a Druid on about 5% mana versus a Druid on about 100% mana are at about 90% of their regular power, because Star Surge is absolutely crazy. It's arguably one of the best runes in the game in terms of what it does. A huge single target nuke, it's got a short cooldown, scales amazing with spell power, and costs a tiny amount of mana. You can technically go and get this rune at level 1 as well, though it's probably going to involve a few corpse runs. I went and soloed it at level 10, no problem, and I recommend that you go out of your way to get it too. It completely changes the class. Star Surge also makes balanced druids a nightmare in PvP, as they can just kite you around in circles and remove about a quarter of your health every 6 seconds with an instant cast spell. So you're probably thinking, damn, this spec's amazing in PvE then too, and no, it's still not really. Yes, Star Surge and Sunfire are great, but outside of that, you're back to casting vanilla spells, and that's not what you want to be doing. Boomies do have a bunch of solid talents to pick up in Phase 2, but I think they need a little more than that to really pick themselves up in PvE. Resto Druids have been a bit of a surprise so far, you know. I wasn't expecting anything too crazy from Druid healers, but it turns out that wild growth is pretty insane. At least in PvE, that is. You have Druids out there beating priests while just pressing this one button throughout a whole raid, and the rest of your heals are still, not so good to be honest, but this spec is nice to bring in PvE for sure. For PvP, it's kind of like Priest in that you're a bit of a hybrid, dealing damage and healing as well, and you probably should be just because of how good Star Surge is. Feral seems to be doing just fine too. I will say I don't see too many feral tanks, but their single target threat seems to be fine, even though they are lacking on the AoE front. If they get a decent AoE rune next phase, they will start to come online big time though. Ferals have also been the only way to get Wind Fury this phase, so it's a good job they're actually doing well beyond just being used for this rune. I'd say they're doing better in PvE than PvP, but can be strong for both areas of the game. It's a pretty straightforward playstyle too, with Mangle into Savage Roar, and you better believe all the melee out there want Wind Fury, so you're always going to have a raid spot. On top of that, you have a bunch to look forwards to next phase with Automatic Crowd Pummeler and Wolf's Head Helm too. Druids have been a big winner of this phase in my opinion. I know we're only a level 25, but typically Druid is either a healer or a flag carrier in vanilla, and now instead of just that, every single one of their identities is doing something cool, so that's something to be happy about. Up next is the Rogue, and it's the first ult I made for Season of Discovery. The reason I wanted to try them out was to see if it's as bad as everyone says they are for leveling. It really wasn't, but I did have gold to buy some greens for them, so that's probably why. And the second reason is because Rogues were doing far better than expected in terms of DPS. I mean, even in PvP, I thought this class was going to be pretty average. Turns out they're also very good in that area of the game, and this is without some of their key abilities such as Cheap Shot, Kidney Shot, and Blind. If a rogue gets on top of you and applies crippling poison, it's honestly a hard fight for the majority of the classes in the game to win, because rogue just does a lot of damage. In PvE, they're a bit of a damage over time class, strangely enough, with Saber Slash and Deadly Poison. The Deadly Brew rune also underwent huge changes pre-launch, which answered every concern I had with rogue poisons. So not only do poisons now scale with your attack power, you essentially have instant poison and deadly poison on both your weapons, as well as still being able to get Wind Fury on your main hand and using a weapon stone on your offhand. Oh, and you can still enchant your weapons too. It's actually 4 separate weapon buffs per weapon as a rogue. No wonder they're doing well when you think about it like that. And with talents such as Blade Flurry and Adrenaline Rush next phase, I'm expecting this class to continue blasting on single target and being amazing on cleave. Rogue Tank is actually doing fine as well, mainly in the raid though. See, trash in the raid is kind of just go pull it, and it borderline doesn't need a proper tank because it just doesn't do any damage. And rogues on single target threat are amazing, so they're well suited to the boss fights in BFD, which are just kind of single target to be honest. In dungeons though, where you only have one healer and the vast majority of pulls are multiple enemies, they still have the predicted issues of controlling multiple mobs, especially when your dynamite cooldown isn't up. Rogues overall though exceeded expectations this phase, very solid class. Next up would have been the mail wearers, but they're still wearing leather this phase, so we'll carry on like that. But we have the Shaman. Shaman tank has been a huge success story in Season of Discovery so far. Very tanky, great single target threat, good AoE threat, and they bring that standard Shaman utility. You can even just pop on the tank rune for PvP and you become really hard for most classes to solo. I do need to play more Horde this season so I can check out the revamped Shami myself firsthand, but so far from what I've seen, having a Shaman tank in your group has only ever been a good thing. Resto has also been doing pretty much what's expected in that it's just doing okay. Expect to power up quite a bit at level 40, by which time you'll have Chain Heal, and don't forget Overload got buffed to a 50% chance, and it can proc off this spell, so that's going to be pretty powerful. Enhancement has been the only melee class finding themselves often a bit lower down on the DPS meters this phase, and recently their dual wield spec rune was buffed up to a huge plus 10% hit chance, and it still hasn't made too much of a difference. I think you really want to see another rune that deals direct damage for enhancement next phase. As cool as Storm Strike is, it's just one extra attack which doesn't do a whole lot of damage. You need a bit more than that. Oh, and of course, don't forget there's very likely going to be a two-handed rune as well once we're getting towards 40, so I'm hopeful to see some improvements for the Wind Fury enjoyers. Elemental suffers from the same problem mages do with Frostbolt and Warlocks do with Shadowbolt. Your Lightning Bolt, your main filler spell, is unfortunately bad because it's the rank you learned at level 20. You also have a ton of talents which are missing too, such as bonus crit damage and cast time reductions. Lava Burst is the star of the show here though, but similar to Balanced Druids, your one overpowered rune isn't enough to carry your damage in PvE content, and as a result they're on the lower end of things. They're good in PvP though. They have Purge, Totems, Frost Shock, and of course Lava Burst. All those make for a good utility pick, and Shamans just never seem to die until their mana bar is spent either. This spec stands to see some huge improvements next phase though, both from talents and better spell ranks. In fact, runes aside, because who knows what we're getting, Elemental should be one of the most improved specs between 25 and 40. Next for the classes which are still wearing leather is the Hunter. This is the most nerfed class in the season, and it's still so powerful. Alongside Priest, this is probably the best PvP class in the game. I mean, I thought they would be good. I had them just behind Warlock in my pre-release video ranking, but they are better than I ever imagined. It turns out when you start letting pets scale with your gear, and you add a rune that gives your pet a ton more damage and focus regeneration, Hunters become pretty broken. Early on, players found that Scorpid's poison was scaling way too well with gear, and your pet would legitimately do more damage than most other classes in the game could. Blizzard eventually got around to nerfing that one. Then players started taming Wind Serpents, whose lightning breath is pretty much like having an elemental shaman as a pet, but one that actually does damage. This is still usable, by the way. In fact, you can solo most other classes in the game just by using Eyes of the Beast on your pet because they do so much damage. Your pet is so powerful you don't even need to leave its growl effect on. It will just keep threats because it will be out damaging you by so much. From a solo play perspective, this is the strongest class in the game by a mile. It even makes Warlock look average in comparison. Pretty much the only issue is that Hunters are the only pure DPS spec left in the game, and are also overplayed at the moment because they're just kind of OP and it doesn't take too long to get to level 25. Also, the Beast Mastery spec doesn't really add much to your Hunter gameplay, and it does feel a lot like vanilla. It's just your pets carrying really hard now. There is also a marksmanship spec that's performing well for hunters too, which leans into you actually pressing some new buttons instead of just sending in your pet to delete what's ever on your screen. I can't wait to see how crazy pets get at level 40 once we get Bestial Wrath. By this level, pets will all have their own sprint type ability too, so they will be completely impossible to get off you in PvP. People are going to get soloed even harder than they already are by Wind Serpents, or who knows by what else, Gorillas maybe next phase. All in all, hunters are doing great as expected, but Beast Mastery is even outperforming where I thought it would be. Finally, we're on to the mail wearers. Paladin, I would say, has very much met expectations. It was one of my top picks heading into the season, and I believe back then every spec would be viable and performing well, and this, I would say, has been true. Though protection isn't quite full-on protection Paladin yet, as two-handed ret tanking is fine for most content. Divine Storm double dips from threats from both its healing and damage, making it incredibly efficient. And Consecration just isn't super worth investing points into the Holy Tree yet. Its mana cost for what it does isn't too attractive. Avenger's Shield is powerful, but you can just macro swap to a shield, throw it out, and then go back to two-handed blasting. Ret itself has seen some huge improvements to how it was in vanilla and feels far more engaging. Crusader Strike and Divine Storm really have made all of the difference. I will say I've leveled a Ret to 25 myself, and not gonna lie, I was disappointed that you couldn't seal twist between Martyrdom and Command. In PvE, Rets aren't quite keeping up with most melee, and if they could do this, it would be a nice single target damage buff. Then again, I find that people love or hate seal twisting, and you would need a separate pair of gloves to put Divine Storm on for AoE, or just manually swap it outside of combat. In PvP, Ret Pallies are monsters, and as predicted, can absolutely global you in a Hammer of Justice. They also bring a ton of utility and should just be getting better and better. I can't wait to see some good old Reckoning Bombs stacking one-shots next phase as well. Holy Pally is doing okay, kind of in a similar place to Resto Shaman. I wasn't expecting them to be too crazy at 25 due to missing a lot of talents and spell ranks, but they're fine to have in the raid. For PvP though, they tend to be pretty vulnerable to getting locked down at the moment, and you probably want to look at playing Ret. Which means we end on what was the most popular class in the game back in 2019. A class which I thought was going to be pretty average at level 25. Well, it turns out even without Berserker stance, or the majority of their important talents or abilities, Warrior is still the best DPS in the game. Okay, for real though, the fact Warriors are the best at level 25 proves how unbelievably broken this class really is in this game. Now, to be fair, pre-release, we didn't know how good all the gear from BFD was going to be, and we've seen improvements week to week as the highly gear-dependent warriors gradually begin to scale up. Also, Blizzard have done a rather unvanilla-like thing in BFD in creating loads of loot which has appropriate stats for its armor type, and on Horde, if you play Warrior, you do not have loot competition for male at 25, and I'm assuming if they follow this design choice at level 40, you won't have competition for plate armor either. On Alliance there are paladins to compete, but I've never really considered armor type for gearing in vanilla before because, I mean, tons of the BIS items were always leather, and now you can play what is eventually the best DPS in the game and have no competition for rolling on armor, assuming you're the only warrior in the raid that is, which isn't too unlikely in 10-man groups at the moment. So yeah, the population for the warrior class is going to absolutely explode heading later on into phase 1, and especially in phase 2. You know that warrior meme on that one slide at BlizzCon about making everyone OP instead of making warriors less OP? Yeah, still got a bit of work to go on that one. In PvP, warriors are currently okay as well, but as per usual, you need a healer behind you, but your lack of Mortal Strike can make it difficult to take down equally geared players. Once you hit 40 though, and are in fully well itemized plate armor, which you probably will be, this class will be completely unstoppable with a good healer behind them. Tank warriors are decent too, can't say I've seen too many of them personally, but they seem to have good single target threat, solid AoE, and with the new runes, actually fairly decent damage. Blizzard also wants tank warriors to properly rock a shield as well this season, which is something new as well. Warriors have snatched victory from the jaws of defeat and have at this early stage of the season still risen to the top for dealing damage, with notable help from Wild Strikes, Homunculi, and some pretty overpowered weapons. I thought warriors would scale up by level 40, but even now, they seem to be doing just fine. They are still very gear dependent though, and you do need a raid comp which really enables you to perform. And that is the meta snapshot for Season of Discovery Phase 1 so far. Again, things are always subject to change, but this phase may be the only time we get to see this level 25 meta for a while to come. So I thought, why not put a video together to get down how things have really played out so far. So let me know your thoughts, how you feel about your class and Season of Discovery at the moment, and what you'd like to see change in the future in the comments down below. And as always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I'll see you all on the next one very soon.